The bridge over the Caen Canal had been renamed Pegasus Bridge after its capture in the early hours of D-Day, a tribute to the winged horse insignia worn by British airborne forces who had seized it in one of the war's most daring operations. By June 7, 1944, the second day after the Normandy invasion, the bridge and its immediate surroundings had become a critical point in the Allied defensive line, holding the eastern flank of the invasion beaches against German counterattacks that sought to drive through to the vulnerable landing areas. British paratroopers and glider troops who had taken the bridge in those first chaotic hours now found themselves defending it against increasingly desperate German attempts to recapture this vital crossing point. The fighting had been fierce but relatively fluid, with both sides launching probing attacks and counterattacks as they tried to establish dominance over the strategic position. It was in this context, on the afternoon of June 7th, that a situation developed that would test the British paratroopers' professionalism and their adherence to the rules of warfare even in the heat of battle. A German counterattack had been repulsed with significant casualties, leaving perhaps 20 German soldiers pinned down in a fortified position near the bridge's eastern approach. These men were effectively surrounded, cut off from their unit and facing overwhelming British firepower from multiple directions. The tactical situation was hopeless. They couldn't advance, couldn't retreat, and couldn't hold their position indefinitely against forces that could bring artillery and armor to bear whenever the British commander decided the position warranted that level of firepower. The reasonable and expected course of action was surrender, which would allow the German soldiers to survive while removing them as a threat without requiring the British to expend resources destroying the position. The British officer commanding the forces surrounding this German position was Major John Howard, the same officer who had led the glider assault that captured Pegasus Bridge in the invasion's opening moments. Howard was an experienced commander who had trained his men extensively for the D-Day operation, and who had earned their complete confidence through his competence and his genuine concern for their welfare. He was also exhausted, having fought continuously for more than 30 hours with minimal rest, and he was acutely aware that every minute spent dealing with this isolated German position was time not spent preparing for the next German counterattack that intelligence suggested was imminent. Howard wanted this situation resolved quickly and with minimal British casualties, which meant encouraging the Germans to surrender rather than having to assault their position. Howard directed that a white flag be displayed and that a German-speaking British soldier call out to the surrounded Germans that they should surrender, that further resistance was pointless, that they would be treated according to the Geneva Conventions, and that continuing to fight would only result in their deaths. The British soldier delivered this message in clear German, in his voice carrying across the relatively short distance that separated the British and German positions. The response came from a German officer whose voice carried the authority of command. He refused the surrender demand, stating that his orders were to hold his position and that he would continue fighting until ordered otherwise by his superiors, or until his position became completely untenable. The refusal was delivered in professional military language, without defiance or bravado, simply a statement that the German officer intended to follow his orders despite the tactical hopelessness of his situation. Howard's reaction to this refusal was a mixture of frustration, respect, and practical calculation about what the situation required. He recognized that the German officer was following military protocol. Surrender decisions were supposed to be made by commanders based on their assessment of the tactical situation, and premature surrender could be considered cowardice or dereliction of duty. Yet Howard also recognized that this particular situation was so clearly hopeless that continued resistance served no military purpose and would only result in unnecessary casualties on both sides. The German position couldn't affect the battle's outcome, couldn't threaten British control of the bridge, couldn't do anything except absorb British attention and resources that were needed elsewhere. Howard made a decision that reflected both military pragmatism and recognition of the peculiar circumstances at Pegasus Bridge, where British and German forces had been fighting at close quarters for a day and a half, and where certain courtesies had developed even in the midst of combat. He ordered his men to maintain their positions surrounding the Germans, but to hold fire unless the Germans attempted to break out, or unless they engaged British forces. He then had his German-speaking soldier relay another message, that the British would not assault the German position immediately, that the Germans were free to continue holding their ground if they insisted, but that British forces would eventually bring up armor and artillery that would destroy the position entirely, and that the German officer was being given time to reconsider his decision and to recognize that honor did not require pointless death. This approach was unusual and risky. It gave the surrounded Germans time to potentially fortify their position further or to coordinate some kind of breakout attempt. It also tied down British forces who needed to maintain the cordon around the German position while this situation resolved itself. But Howard calculated that the risks were minimal given the tactical situation, and that allowing the German officer to surrender on his own terms rather than under immediate threat would likely resolve the situation more quickly and with better morale effects than a forced assault would achieve. There was also an element of professional respect involved. Howard recognized that the German officer was in an impossible situation, trying to follow orders while facing the reality that those orders made no tactical sense, and that allowing him some dignity in finding a way out of that situation might encourage similar German commanders to surrender more readily in future situations. What happened over the next 2 hours revealed something about how military culture and professional codes operated even in the midst of total war. The German officer, whose name would later be confirmed as Major Wilhelm Richter, used the time Howard had given him to assess his situation more thoroughly, to communicate with what remained of his chain of command, and apparently to come to terms with the reality that continued resistance would achieve nothing except the deaths of the men under his command. Richter sent out another message, delivered by one of his soldiers carrying an improvised white flag, requesting to speak directly with the British commander to discuss terms of surrender. Howard agreed to this meeting, which took place in the open ground between the positions with both commanders, accompanied by armed soldiers, but with both sides agreeing not to fire during the parley. The conversation between Howard and Richter, conducted in a mixture of German and English with assistance from interpreters, revealed the complicated psychology of military surrender in situations where honor and pragmatism created conflicting obligations. Richter explained that his orders had been to hold his position as part of a larger counterattack plan that had already failed, that he had initially refused surrender because those orders remained technically valid, but that he now recognized that continuing to follow orders that the tactical situation had rendered meaningless served no purpose. He requested assurance that his men would be treated properly as prisoners of war, that their surrender would be recorded as having occurred only after their position became genuinely untenable, and that Howard would document that the Germans had fought well before surrendering. These requests were partly about protecting Richter's professional reputation and partly about ensuring his men wouldn't face recrimination from other German forces for having surrendered. Howard agreed to these terms, recognizing that they cost him nothing and that they allowed Richter to surrender while maintaining the fiction that he had followed proper military protocol. The formal surrender was conducted with unexpected ceremony. The German soldiers emerged from their position in formation, still carrying their weapons, which they then stacked in an organized pile before being searched and processed as prisoners. Richter rendered a formal salute to Howard, which Howard returned despite the irregularity of saluting an enemy officer, and then the Germans were marched away to POW collection points, while British forces secured the position they had been defending. The entire process was conducted with a professional courtesy that seemed almost absurd, given that these men had been trying to kill each other minutes earlier and would resume trying to kill other enemy soldiers as soon as tactical circumstances permitted. The incident became something of a legend among British airborne forces at Pegasus Bridge, detold and retold as an example of how professional soldiers could manage conflict even in the chaotic first days of the Normandy invasion. Howard's decision to give Richter time and dignity in surrendering was generally viewed as having been correct. The situation had been resolved with no British casualties and with minimal delay, and it had established a precedent that other German commanders in hopeless positions might remember when deciding whether to surrender or fight to the death. Some of Howard's superiors questioned whether he had taken unnecessary risks by not immediately assaulting the German position, but the successful outcome vindicated his judgment and reinforced his reputation as a commander who understood both tactical necessity and human psychology. For Richter and his men, our surrender at Pegasus Bridge meant survival and eventual repatriation after the war, outcomes that would have been far less certain if Howard had chosen to assault their position, rather than giving them time to surrender on terms that preserved some element of military honor. Richter's experience as a POW was apparently unremarkable. He was processed through the British prisoner system, spent the war's remainder in camps in Britain and later Canada, and eventually returned to Germany where he had to navigate the complicated landscape of being a defeated officer in a country grappling with its recent past. Whether he ever reflected on how Howard's decision to give him time and dignity had saved his life and the lives of his men is unknown, though the formal courtesy of their final exchange suggests both men recognized something significant in how the situation had been handled. The broader significance of the incident lay in what it revealed about how military professionalism could coexist with total war, how codes of conduct could persist even when warfare reached industrial scales of destruction, and how individual commanders could make choices that prioritized unnecessary killing even when military regulations would have permitted more violent approaches. Howard's decision wasn't motivated primarily by humanitarian concern. He needed to resolve the situation efficiently and get back to preparing for the next German attack. But his choice to give Richter time and dignity in surrendering reflected recognition that enemy soldiers were professional men in impossible situations rather than simply targets to be destroyed, and that treating them as such might serve military purposes better than treating them purely as enemies to be eliminated. The incident also highlighted the strange intimacy of combat at places like Pegasus Bridge, where opposing forces fought at close quarters for extended periods, and where individual personalities and decisions could shape outcomes in ways that weren't possible in more fluid or long-range combat situations. Howard and Richter had never met before their parley, yet their brief interaction had been shaped by mutual professional respect and by recognition that both were trying to fulfill their duties while minimizing unnecessary suffering. This didn't make them friends or allies. They remained enemies who would have killed each other if tactical circumstances required it. But it did create a space where humanity could coexist with warfare, where the rules and courtesies of military culture could temper the pure destructiveness of combat in ways that benefited everyone involved.